Scott's pretty great too, but thank you for that introduction. I am really happy to be here. I enjoy these webinars, and I especially enjoy interacting and questions. I don't just like to hear myself talk, even though it probably seems that way because I do these a lot. But I love Prodependence. This is a Prodependence-based webinar. So Prodependence is a new way to look at family members and loved ones, spouses, partners of people who struggle with chronic mental illness, even chronic physical illness. I agree with Scott. It could be applicable to anyone in any circumstance, anytime there's a relationship. We can look at it from a prodependent lens, which is about attachment, and we are wired and meant to be wired and in close relation to each other. And that is actually a part of mental health and good mental health, and not about detaching and letting people go per se. And sometimes that's necessary, but that's not what prodependence is about. It's about connection and healthy connection, and figuring out how to do that. So today, I thought I would start with a little bit of content. I like to bring up sometimes things that come up in my world, in my work. And one of the things that actually Matt Wheeler and I have been discussing this week, there's a lot of language sometimes in the healing world around safety. You'll hear a lot of things about safety, lack of safety, need for safety. If I'm a addict, providing safety when I'm healing for my partner or my loved ones is important, because I created an unsafe environment, most likely, when I was lying and deceiving and doing hurtful things and harmful things, both to myself and the people I love. If I'm a partner or family member, most likely I'm seeking safety. I'm seeking safe communication. I'm seeking safe spaces to express myself and to talk about how I feel. I need physical safety. Oftentimes, addiction puts the partner and the family in harm's way. So I'm looking for all sorts of safety. So that's a term that we use quite often. And what we were talking about this week is sometimes safety, feeling unsafe, and feeling unsafe and then feeling uncomfortable get mixed. They get crossed. Sometimes we're in situations we feel uncomfortable, but they're not necessarily unsafe. And we want to sometimes use that language because safety sounds like it has more punch to it. So we'll say, well, I'm not safe. I'm not having this conversation, when really I'm just uncomfortable. And so I think it's an important element, because I think that idea of safety can be used in an unhealthy way, and it can be weaponized sometimes inside of a relationship as it's attempting to heal. So there'll be times when I'll say, somebody will refuse to have a conversation, or I've been trying to communicate with my addict partner, or I've been trying to communicate with my drug addicted son, and the minute I bring up something that they don't want to talk about, they immediately pull out this is unsafe. Right now, you're an unsafe person. And unless you are at physical harm's way, or somebody's being intentionally abusive, manipulative, hurtful, it's most likely not unsafe. It's super uncomfortable. It's hard to have confrontation sometimes, and have difficult conversations about honesty, about trust, about hurt, about heavy emotions. So sometimes there's a challenge there. Am I really feeling unsafe, or I am just super uncomfortable and unfamiliar with having these difficult interactions or conversations, because I'm just not used to doing that. We're not used to having that honesty and that raw connection, and showing up truly who I am, and not a shell of who I am, not just what I'm putting out an image or portraying an image of what I think the person wants to see. So when you use the word safety, it should be legitimately about safety. It should be, I feel like I'm not going to be abused, hurt, manipulated, and that's physically, emotionally, spiritually, that I'm in a situation where I'm not going to walk away more injured then I showed up. And that's fairly rare, to be honest, in healing. It does happen. There's times when someone will go into rage. You start talking and someone starts raging, screaming, yelling, throwing, pushing. Those are unsafe situations. Or manipulation, or gaslighting, or lying. Those are not safe conversations for the person who is being gaslit, or raged at, or lied to. But having a hard conversation about boundaries or needs or wants, like we talked about last week, those are just uncomfortable. And most people will not love sitting in those and having those, because oftentimes they're looking for resolution, and there's no resolution right away. We're just sorting it out. I think Brene Brown uses the word rumble. It's one of my favorite new words. They're just rumbling, trying to figure out how to do something different. So that was kind of my thought for today. If you guys have any questions about that, if you've experienced that where I thought I was unsafe, but maybe I was just uncomfortable, or I have a partner who keeps saying he or she is unsafe, and really they just don't want to have the conversation, or they just don't want to be in that situation. So those are some thoughts that are kind of rumbling around in my head. Pardon me, sorry.
I'm muted. I was saying, thank you, Kim. Ask us questions using the Q&A feature. We don't have any in the queue right now, so if you get one in real quick, you'll be first. I did want to say, addicts are notorious for avoiding emotional discomfort. And I have seen a lot of addicts say, oh, this is unsafe, when it's not. But because I'm an addict, are just using it as another way to avoid actually engaging in a relationship with someone. Is it more likely to be the addict who doesn't want to have the uncomfortable conversation, or the betrayed partner who doesn't want to have the uncomfortable conversation and reaches for, oh, I feel unsafe, to avoid it?
In my experience, I hate to lean, but in my experience, that tends to be more the addict who has probably been avoiding, like you said, those deep connections in that relationship for a while. But I have seen it used both ways. I've seen partners use it too, because they don't like what's being said, or they don't want someone setting a boundary with them or whatever. So they're like, this is unsafe. You're this and I'm that. And, it's like, nope, this is uncomfortable. You don't want to have this conversation, because intimacy has been broken in this relationship. Maybe if it's somebody who's dealing with infidelity or sex addiction or something like that. But even drug addiction or alcoholism, all of that, I do those behaviors to avoid intimacy, to avoid connection. And I mean, deep conversations about feelings or needs or boundaries, those are going to be intimate conversations. They're not going to be about, wow, the weather, and it's going to be painful, because the reason I do my addictions to avoid feeling that pain, to avoid feeling uncomfortable. So we want to be really clear about what's comfort and what's safety and what's comfort. Getting better will require a lot of uncomfortable situations, uncomfortable conversations, uncomfortable confrontations, uncomfortable experience of emotion. So avoiding that's very common for an addict. But I've seen it on both sides, but it tends to lean that way just a little for me.
Yeah, I'm not surprised by that answer at all. Do you see with couples, sometimes there's a dance that they know really well around avoiding uncomfortable, and I know I do this step, you do that step, I do this step, you do that step, and suddenly we don't have to talk about anything?
Absolutely. They actually, yes, it's an actual, it is like it's like someone that I've danced with, I mean, metaphorically, for a long time. We dance around the hard topic. Maybe I need to set a boundary. Maybe I need to express a feeling. Maybe I need to deal with, maybe I need to admit a slip or a relapse. Maybe I need to talk about fear. All those are very vulnerable. To put myself in a situation are super vulnerable, and it feels frightening and scary. So yes, couples tend to have their two-step. They kind of know, they may break it up with laughter. They do the whole, I'm not safe, or they do, there's all sorts of ways we avoid But I really believe, this is just Kim, this isn't, I don't know, nobody else, but I really believe that to the degree we show up in the relationship and we are willing to have those difficult conversations and be uncomfortable, really shows our commitment and our desire to connect with that person. Because we don't take risk with people that don't matter. You know what I mean? It takes a lot of grit, I will say, and it takes a lot of courage. But I think even if you're going to tell me something difficult, but you were willing, like if you were going to tell me that you had a relapse or that you broke my trust, that's going to be terrible to hear and highly uncomfortable. But at least you took the risk. You care about me enough to live honestly with me. That's pretty powerful, but super uncomfortable. And that's not to say couples don't need to learn how to be, or families or whatever don't need to learn how to be safe and create safety. So disclosures are safe. So, feelings are safe, but be super clear about being safe and being uncomfortable.
Yeah. You kind of made me think about, I've got a couple sponsees right now in relationships, and they're men in relationship with women, and they're constantly saying, man, she just rips into me all the time. And my response is, that's good. Mm-hmm. And they don't understand. I'm like, no, if she didn't care, if she was done, she wouldn't be ripping into you. She'd be talking to her lawyer and letting her lawyer rip into you. She wants to, so why don't we talk about ways that you can take these conversations and make them productive, or steer them in a productive direction? Because we don't waste time on people we're done with or that we don't care about in the first place.
Very good point. Yes, absolutely. And I think the degree that we feel upset or we want to lash out sometimes or any of that, sometimes we can look at that. This is a kind of a very prodependent way to look at things. That is a degree that I really care. The intensity I feel probably mimics the intensity of my love for this person. Otherwise, I wouldn't. So, but we have to manage that, of course. We have to manage that intensity and not be abusive and hurtful, no matter what side we're on. But recognizing there is a certain amount, if I didn't love you, and I didn't want to be in relation with you, I would be ambivalent, most likely. I would let my lawyer, and we've seen that happen when things deteriorate to that point. But learning how, I mentioned this last week, learning how to sit in uncomfortable situations is teaching probably a muscle that has never been used in your body to work for the first time. You are going to want to, just like me, when I'm on a treadmill and I haven't been on it in a long time, want to get off. Like the first thing I want to do is first time I start sweating, first time I start feeling uncomfortable, I want to get off the treadmill. But if I do that, I don't grow and I don't progress. So my encouragement is, if it's a safe environment but uncomfortable, grab some courage and be uncomfortable. You will make progress if you're willing.
This first question here, and by the way, type in questions for us. I got a couple now, but give us some more. Very related to what you've been talking about. Can you talk about reactive abuse? So maybe talk a little bit about reactivity versus responding, and then reactive abuse.
Right. So I think what you're meaning is when we're having people are reacting in a negative way and react abusively to difficult conversations or situations. Usually reactive abuse, or if somebody's being abusive, they're probably in rage. And remember, I think I've mentioned this before, rage is a mixture of a lot of different feelings. It's a mixture of all the intense feelings. So we need boundaries there. We need to recognize if it is truly abusive and I am being hurt and called names, physically, emotionally, whatever. Like if I'm being manipulated, if I'm being blackmailed, any of that stuff would not be productive. Those would not be productive situations where I would need to get safe and provide, create safety there so we can have those conversations. Reactive abuse is not okay. We want to be able to become an actor, not a reactor. And that has a lot to do with the recovery process. It's figuring out what triggers my shame. What triggers because most people are reactionary because it hits their wound of shame. Something bumps up against it and then they, no sir, and why would you ask that? And I thought I told you, and away goes the conversation goes down the toilet, or the situation. So I think each individual has to understand their shame, what messages trip their shame, and how they respond when they are in their shame. Um, and we all can be tripped by our shame. And if I'm an addict and I have a lot of shame, like internal shame that has built up over a lot of years of, not treating myself kindly and lying and doing all those kind of things, I probably have a deep well of shame that has to be addressed. So there'll be a lot of boundaries. I would use if that's going on, a lot of reactionary abuse that way, I would have a therapist help us navigate and create boundaries for our situations or our interactions that would minimize that hurt. But recognize most people, it's not coming from hate for the person, it's coming from a deep dislike of themselves, but it splashes on to the person that they're claiming to love.
The follow-up to that is this individual was talking about being abused and reacting with abuse in kind. She says she's heard that this might have to do or might be related to complex post-traumatic stress disorder.
Oh, I see. Okay, I probably answered that not how you wanted.
Well, yeah, no, this was I thought you were on target until I saw the follow-up. I was like, oh, different kind of reactive abuse.
Right. So I think what you're referring to is somebody's own history of abuse and how they react when that gets triggered, when that gets bumped.
Well, I mean, you may have some post-traumatic stress disorder, and I call you some really nasty names, and you respond with really nasty abusive names in kind because I've triggered your PTSD, I think is the question.
I put that wound, right. Complex PTSD is tricky too, and it is often related to those kind of responses because it's such a deep and present. So I get in those moments very easily. I go to these places where I can't think clearly, and my body gets involved, my mind gets involved, and I'm not able to respond rationally when those things get triggered. Again, I still think it would require, first of all, individual work around the PTSD so that I don't attach the PTSD, my own background or the background work to what's currently going on. And that has to be done a lot anyway in the healing process, because it is not uncommon for old stuff to get triggered by current situations. That happens all the time. So we want to be clear. We want to be clear about what belongs to who. Does this belong to, is this really this person that's caused me this pain? Or is it, yes, this person causes me pain, but it feels much bigger because of my history, my own history that I'm coming in with. Or the abuser, the person who is being abusive or reactionary, what's their background? Like what's going on with them? And I might ask a question that seems completely benign. Where were you today? I tried to call you during lunch, and they have something in their history that it related to that, and they may react totally, like just overreact and in their trauma, and then breaks down that relationship and our ability to connect. So it would require work. With a professional, I think, to sort out old past wounds and current wounds so that they don't all turn into a big giant wrecking ball, that comes in and wrecks the relationship.
Yeah, I have PTSD. I've done a lot of work on it. And it doesn't matter how much work I do on it, I still find myself, something happens small now, but it feels huge, and I'm feeling the little bit that I should be feeling right now, and a whole bunch of stuff from 40 years ago. And, I have to pause, and sometimes I just have to back away and just kind of sort it out and be like, okay, here's what's happening now. Push the old stuff aside and do some more work on it later, when I'm up for it. But I'm just going to deal with the reality of the situation now. And, and that's kind of the trick with PTSD, is to be able to separate now and then. But, there are two people in my life right now who trigger my PTSD. They both know they do it. I've talked about it with them, and I'm like, look, you can look at me and say, are you mad at me or someone else. You know, you're perfectly allowed to do that, and that will cause me to stop and say, okay, well, I'm a little bit mad at you, but not like I just reacted. Sorry about that. Let's back up. You know.
So it's bringing, so PTSD, thank you for that. And I think it's bringing the understanding about my trauma from my reactionary brain, the part of my brain that is sort of automatic, our fight, flight, and freeze response, into the frontal cortex, so that we can, like Scott is saying, we can say, oh wait, that is about this, and this is about this. And I often call those shadows when I'm working with individuals. I'll say something like, I've had people who will have these strong reactions to people. They'll come into one of my groups, and then I will inevitably get the phone call a couple of days later, I can't be in that group. And why? So-and-so, I don't like him. I'm like, okay, you know him for exactly 1 hour. How is it that you don't like him? Is that about him, or do you have a shadow that he reminds you of that you have aversive response to? Like, tell me a little bit about that. Who does he remind, or she, or whatever, remind you of? And they'll be like, oh yeah, it reminds me of my dad. It reminds me of, you know, this friend that abandoned me when I was younger. So those, recognizing how to separate all that is so important. And that really does take a professional sometimes to help sort through that, particularly with complex, not just PTSD, but complex PTSD is a little bit deeper and stronger, and the reactions will be more intense.
I'm going to get to this other question we have in a minute, but as a therapist, do you find sometimes having that triggering person in a group is actually therapeutically helpful over time?
Yes, if they're willing to stick with it, and they're willing to internally acknowledge that this is not about this person. This person reminds me of, we call that transference. That's another word we have in therapy. I'm transferring my feelings about this situation or person onto this situation or person. It's not uncommon. I've walked into a room and thought, we're not going to be friends. This person, I don't even know them. Yeah. So I have to be really like paying close attention internally to what's going on with me. And I will always say, okay, who is this in your life? Who's showing up? Like what situation in your life is being triggered right now? Because this clearly doesn't warrant the response that you're having. So we call that transference, but it can be very, very therapeutically helpful. It can actually help heal. I love group work for this reason. That can actually help heal even some of the past wounding, if you can sit with that and work it out, and that person's willing to stand in that space for you and let you work it out with them. We do things called clearings, where we'll clear that energy between the two over and over and over until the trauma can be separated from the person.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Next question here. What's the best way to start to develop these healthy, honest conversations early on in recovery? How should we be having them in order to build those skills? So when you're feeling uncomfortable, how do you go ahead and push forward?
I think you just start having them. Probably a lot of these haven't been happening if there's been ongoing addiction. So you're going to fumble and bumble. I tell people all the time, this isn't about perfect. We haven't been perfect up to now. Why are we going to start now? Like, we're not doing that. What we're going to do is we're going to try. And I always say, sometimes it's helpful to time your conversations. People don't like doing that, but I feel particularly if you know it's a hot topic or it's going to be a difficult topic to cover, then I would time it. Time it for 10 minutes, time it for 15, and be done. And also manage your expectations about the results of those conversations. The fact that we can show up, hold space for the other person's feelings, thoughts, beliefs, truth. If we can do that, we are doing something good, and we are growing and progressing. Sometimes we think we have to resolve that problem right then, or we have to walk away feeling so peachy and good. We just gotta have warm fuzzies inside. And maybe the fact that we just even agreed to the conversation and had the conversation might be enough. So manage your expectations early on, set times if you need to, have boundaries if it goes here or there, but decide on the boundaries before you're in the conversation, because no one's going to appreciate, in the middle of a conversation, I have a boundary, and it's not going to work out. So it's going to be more about being uncomfortable and not wanting to be in it. So I would set the boundaries, like if you give each other permission to walk away, but commit to come back. That's another thing with these kind of conversations. It's okay to walk away and take a break, but it doesn't feel good to say, I feel uncomfortable, I'm unsafe right now, and I'm out of here. And then it leaves the person like, do you care? Do so say, I care about you. I know this is an important conversation to have. I just can't do it right now, but can we come back tomorrow, or maybe tomorrow evening when the kids are in bed, or at lunch, or whatever. Always commit to come back. So start having the conversations. And if you find yourself, it's like impossible, we find ourselves like just at complete odds, get a couples therapist. Have them at least initially help you set up some guidelines for communication. It will help a lot. I do that. I don't recommend lots of couples work, couples therapy early in the recovery process. That's usually pretty far in, but at least some couple sessions where we can set up some guidelines for safety, and so both people feel as heard as possible in situations that are sometimes difficult, and conversations that are sometimes difficult to be in.
Yeah. For those of you who have not been on a session where my cat has photobombed us, this is Lily, and she wants some attention today. Dr. Rob has in his book, Out of the Doghouse, I think he calls it a respectful conflict agreement. And I'm pretty sure I've posted that online on Sex and Relationship Healing. So if you just go to our search feature and type respectful conflict agreement, it's very useful when you're having conflict, but it really kind of any uncomfortable conversation, even when you're not in conflict. It's just a set of guidelines. You agree to certain things, like we're going to approach this discussion as if we're on the same team. We're fighting the problem, not each other. The problem is we can't agree on who's going to take the kids to school and who's going to pick them up. We're not fighting each other. We're fighting that problem, and we're going to come up with a solution. We're not going to have heated conversations before 9 a.m. or after 9 p.m. We're not going to have heated conversations in the bedroom. We're not going to have heated conversations in front of the kids or in public, or, things like that. And time limit, you mentioned, 15 minutes. And if we're not done, that's okay. We'll revisit it later. We don't have to resolve it right now. And also being able to take a time out. If I'm truly feeling overwhelmed and I'm getting reactive rather than being able to listen and respond, it's okay for me to say, I need a 15-minute timeout. I'm going to walk around the block and chat with my sponsor on the phone, and then we can revisit this in 15 minutes and pick it up again. All sorts of little things like that can be really, really helpful.
I love that. There was I used one similar to that. I like the way that it's approached about solving the problem together. We're fighting the problem, not each other. I love that approach. Years ago, there was one in another book I read called A Fair Fighting Contract. And the concept was very similar, but it was basically boundaries we set within the relationship that we are going to abide by when we are having a conflict. Time is one of them. Not fighting in front of the kids is one of them. Not putting the commitment to the relationship and weaponizing that. I'm done. I probably made a mistake. What am I doing? I'm out of here. Things that would breach that and make it more unstable, your commitment to the relationship. Not using abusive language, not raging, not holding people, no physical rage, no physical abuse. I love those because I think it gives you permission to have a discussion, but you guys have both agreed to what our parameters will be. So get out of the doghouse. I get it, because that sounds like a really good format that you could use to get started.
And I do think that's posted on relationshiphhealing.com. So if you don't want to buy Doghouse.
Still get out of the doghouse, but find it on the website. Yeah.
Yeah, or both. There's a lot of other good info in Out of the Doghouse.
Oh, you weren't kidding. That's a really, really good book.
Um,
Rob has many of those, Dr. Rob. So thank you for the questions, you guys. Keep them coming.
yeah, next question. My partner has been sober for 6 months and is in active recovery for 4 months. When I ask what she physically enjoyed about sex with others, she says, I am pain shopping and that she doesn't feel safe. So she says the questioner is pain shopping by asking that question. And that makes her feel unsafe. I'm seeking the information to improve our own sexual interaction. Is this her discomfort, shame, or is it actually about safety? Interesting question.
Okay, I'm just reading through it for myself too, contextually here. We ask what she physically enjoyed about sex with others. I am pain shopping. So by pain shopping, I would assume that means I'm trying to stop my pain. Like
I think that's like I want to be in pain so I can get reactive. That's how I read pain shopping.
okay.
Maybe the questioner can let us know. Type it in.
Use some clarification there. That might be helpful. I'm seeking this information to prove our own sexual interaction. Is this her own discomfort, shame, or actually about safety? It sounds to me like discomfort and shame, not so much about safety. That would be something that your partner would need to figure out, you know, would want to figure out for herself, what that's about. I think sometimes when we have to be careful if you're the partner of a sex addict that whatever they've done acting out in their addiction or acting out with others they weren't giving the best they had. It wasn't in an addiction. It's very compulsive. It's not usually healthy in any way. So you want to be really careful as a partner that I'm not trying to compete with that in any way in my own interactions, because usually those interactions aren't about anything but a lot trying to self-medicate the unhealthy things inside of me. If it's addictive, if that's what's going on. So any other ideas, Scott? I'm still trying to contextually.
Yeah, I mean, what this kind of reminds me of is the flip side, where addicts really do this. They will pick a fight with their spouse so that they can get angry and use that as an excuse to go and act out. It's part of their addictive cycle. And, you know, this is sort of the betrayed partner, you know, am I picking a fight or not? You know, I want to know what's going on, but my partner seems to think I'm picking a fight. You know, or, you know, is this about discomfort and shame or actually about safety? And I agree with Kim. I think it's probably way more about discomfort and shame than safety. This is just an uncomfortable conversation. You know, now this is something, you know, what did you physically enjoy about sex with other people? Maybe that could be rephrased as, what could I do in our relationship to give you more sexual satisfaction because I want to do that? You know, instead of saying what did others do for you that I didn't, just say what can I do for you that will satisfy you, because I'd like to do that. I mean, there's always a way to kind of reframe. You know, if you're asking a question and getting a bad response, maybe ask the question differently in a way that's going to cause less reactivity and cause less shame, and, you know, and maybe bring you closer, which it sounds like is ultimately what you're trying to do here.
Right. And you're in the very early stages too here, like got active recovery for 4 months, sobriety for 6 is awesome. Like that's a really, really amazing start, but there's still a lot. It's pretty messy trying to figure out what's what, why I do what I do, what motivates. If I'm the addict, what motivates me? And I think asking the questions about that could be painful for you as the partner, asking really painful, what did you do with others that I could, like, yeah, I love what Scott said. What can I do for you? What do you need from me? Are you aware of that? Because that's so much for an addict. They will compulsively act out sexually, but they're not necessarily meeting their needs and wants. They're not doing that. They're going with intensity and not intimacy. And you are offering intimacy and connection with sexuality, which is the best of the best. So I would really think about reframing that into what can I do? How can I create more connection? How will you feel most loved and most pleasure inside our relationship? Not because she didn't seek out other relationships for necessarily intimacy, which is what you're offering, which is a little.
Yeah, sex addiction is not about sex. It's not about intimacy. It's about escape. It's about getting out of my head. I'm having some emotional or psychological or even physical discomfort, and I want to distract myself from it. And sexual acting out, pornography, affairs, all of that stuff, it creates a massive dopamine and adrenaline rush, and it distracts us from whatever is bothering us. It's the same reaction as if we started doing cocaine. The brain responds in the exact same way. It's a very powerful drug, and it's more about distraction than sexual satisfaction. So.
Yes, absolutely true. So keep that in mind, because sometimes I think as a partner, it feels like, oh, they gave their, they were getting a lot of pleasure and gave their best to this. And it wasn't even about the sex at all. It was about all the things that Scott just said.
It's entirely possible the sex was horrible. I mean,
and painful sometimes, not necessarily the physical act of sex, but just painful, like painful because I know I betrayed myself. I betrayed the person I claimed to love. It didn't fix me. I thought it might, maybe in the moment when I'm in my addictive brain, but all it did is cause more problems, more pain, emotionally and otherwise, more shame. Yep. Thank you for your question.
Yeah. I find that I react to my husband's addiction counselor. I believe I do this for several reasons. First, my husband arrived late to our first meeting, and I was forced to kick off the meeting on my own and was uncomfortable. I felt uncomfortable just being alone there with the therapist. Second, the therapist really wanted to lecture versus host a session with the three of us. He spoke over me several times, would not let me ask a question about the process, and I felt trapped. Third, it reminds me of my husband's porn addiction. I know this is a situation of being uncomfortable, not unsafe, but I feel like I need to get over this feeling as they will likely want a joint meeting again. Any recommendations?
Thank you for your
First of all, how common is it for to have a joint meeting with your husband's therapist?
Pretty common.
Oh, okay. All right.
I think it really just depends. Like, sometimes it's just to do some general like connection work or boundary work, like I was talking about earlier, or setting up some guidelines. Sometimes if I'm working with the addict, I will ask the partner to come in just so I have some perspective. And also I'm aware of his or her or their need. And that because if they're trying to keep the relationship together, I'm looking at it as a whole. I'm working with this person, of course, and I am advocating for them. But if they are interested in managing and keeping the relationship together, I want as much information as I can, if possible, so I can be helpful with that as well. And sometimes the partner is a plethora of information, that the addict's not even able to express to me, depending on where we are. But that does happen.
And also a reality check, which is much needed sometimes in early recovery.
Yeah. And sometimes she or he will say to me, yeah, they probably haven't told you this, but this is part of the, or this or this. And so sometimes it just helps to keep people honest and, so we're not spinning our wheels, the addict's not spinning their wheels and that kind of thing. First, I want to say, I'm sorry that happened, the first meeting. And being uncomfortable with I think that would be an uncomfortable situation. If I knew I was there for him and I assume my husband in this case, yeah, my husband was late, I just feel like if I was showing up there for him to be helpful and he didn't show up, that would stink. I would not like that. I don't like the fact that he felt talked over. My encouragement for you would be to tell that therapist what you need. We talked about needs and wants last week. To me, if I were in that situation, I would want to walk in and say, hey, I had a real tough time last time we met together, and this is why. I am so sorry. My phone just went off and interrupted me. I had a really difficult time, and these are why. You don't have to be super confrontational, but if it's a therapist, they can handle it. They should be able to handle that. And these are a couple of things that happened. So I would really appreciate it if, whatever those needs are, I want to be, I don't want to feel like I'm talked over. I'd like you to ask my opinion. I'd like you to get my feedback. I also felt like I had some things to ask and there wasn't time for that. You were too busy talking about things and I hope that people will come to me and tell me that and not sit there and I know that's a really difficult thing to do, to advocate and stand up for yourself. But like I said, if anybody could handle it, I would hope it would be a therapist, particularly a therapist who's working with addiction. They should be pretty thick-skinned and they realize that we're in a tough situation. This couple, in this case, you're in a tough situation and you're trying to sort out a lot of things. So they should be able to hold that space for you. If not, I would have a conversation with my husband and say, I'm not really comfortable with your therapist, and maybe you want to get your own therapist and bring him there instead for those kind of things. That's another option. But I wouldn't shame myself for not liking to be, I wouldn't beat myself up for having that feeling. And those are awkward and uncomfortable moments, especially early, like when you're meeting a therapist, it's hard anyway. So for those things to happen, I'm sorry that happened.
Yeah, I'm sorry that happened too. Not every therapist is for every person. Personalities are very different. And yeah, if I felt uncomfortable, but if my husband was getting a lot out of that therapy and I felt uncomfortable and they wanted another joint session and I had my own therapist, I would want my therapist to be there with me, maybe, just to have my advocate in the room. A lot of times I think betrayed partners, if they're in the room with their, cheating partner and therapist, who's the cheating partner's therapist, they can feel ganged up on, or it feels like 2 against 1, and that's not comfortable either. And that does feel unsafe.
Absolutely. That could be, and I don't know the gravity of what you've been through in your relationship, but the fact that, there was the husband and the husband's therapist is a male and you've had some injury, by the person, the male person closest to you, it would make sense that you might, there might be a little bit of fear going into that. And that's a little bit of trauma response could be too. I'm going in alone with a male I don't know. I'm talking about my sexuality and my husband's addiction. To me, that could be a very potentially vulnerable position emotionally for you. So again, I wouldn't beat myself up at all. And if I go back, I would state my needs and what I experienced, maybe even say, could I talk to you for a minute alone? Or just a couple minutes, or maybe call me on the phone before our session. I have some things to ask. You could do that. Or like Scott said, you could bring your therapist with you. You could switch it up and the couple stuff, maybe your therapist, you bring your husband into your therapy for those kind of couples things that you might need. But yeah, those are my recommendations, and don't feel pressured to do another meeting. You don't have to. You really don't.
Yeah, I completely agree. If you're really, really uncomfortable and don't want to do it, you don't have to do it. I mean, you don't have to do it.
And then if you challenge yourself and think, okay, let me try this again. Let's see if I see my need and can he show up, or this therapist show up for me a little bit differently, it might go very well. So what you decide, it's up to you.
Yeah. This goes back to our question earlier about pain shopping. This is from the same person. Just for context, this is a same-sex female couple. The cheating partner acted out exclusively with males. One affair lasted for 9 years. Can you talk a little bit about, this is a lesbian couple where one of the partners, the sex addiction partner, was acting out exclusively with males.
Well, I think that adds another layer of confusion and pain for the partner. I think that because I think it's very much like even in a heterosexual relationship where the male addict, for example, will go act out with men, but clearly he's heterosexual, but he will act out with men. To me, this is all addiction. It's all addiction, and sometimes the intensity drives the addiction, and whatever creates intensity is what the addict, more intensity is what the addict will go for. It's not necessarily always aligned with my orientation or my, it will just be this is new, this is exciting, this is intense. Maybe this will take my pain away. Maybe this will take my feelings away. Maybe this will make me feel better. But I just want to acknowledge it's a layer of, it's an extra layer that would be very painful, because not that we ever should, but you don't, it feels like I can't compete with that, I shouldn't want to do that, but that feels very like confusing, I guess, and painful for the partner. And 9 years is a long time. 9 years is a really long time. So there's a lot of to unpack there, I would say, as far as getting, and make sure that you do a full disclosure. I would, and with a therapist when you guys are ready. I would have therapists help you with the full disclosure, because that's a lot of time to be in a relationship and to be betrayed. And I think for me, I would want to know as much as I could know, so I could make decisions for myself that were healthy.
As far as acting out with males, in this case, we got this question from betrayed female partners via email on sex and relationship healing all the time. Their husband is at the gym acting out with men, or in public restrooms acting out with men, or hiring male hustlers, and they want to know if he's gay. And the answer is, we don't know. Maybe not. Maybe he's bi. Maybe he's perfectly straight. And and we try to explain again that sex addiction is not about the sex. That's number one. It's about and sex addiction escalates over time. Our brains adjust to this dopamine adrenaline rush. We produce less dopamine and less adrenaline, and the neurons that receive dopamine and adrenaline and create the sensation of pleasure, our brain sort of kills some of those off. So we have to engage in more of the same behavior or a more intense behavior to get the same high. It's nobody starts out shooting heroin. I start out drinking beer, and then it's 2 beers gets me drunk the first time, and 6 months later I need 4 beers, and by the time I graduate from high school I need 6 or 8, and by the time I'm out of college I'm taking drugs and drinking hard liquor, and by the time I'm 30 I wake up one day and I've got a needle in my arm and I'm passed out in an alley and there's blood everywhere and I don't know how I got there. I didn't start out to be a heroin addict. Your partner didn't start out probably as a sex addict. I'll go ahead with the male partner who's acting out with males, even though that's not the question here. But he probably just escalated into more and more taboo, more and more sex addicts continually, as the addiction progresses, engage in behaviors that go against our values, that don't even turn us on. But they do create the intensity, the neurochemical intensity in our brain that keeps us going back for more and more and more and more intense and higher. It just happens. The addictions spiral out of control, and we do things that that aren't us, but we do them anyway. So, do you see that a lot, Kim? Or?
Absolutely. That's exactly how the brain works. Yeah, you're not intending one thing, it just happens that way. This is a lot of work for your partner to also figure herself out, like what's going on with me and with her own therapy. And I hope that you also have a really good therapist that can help you unpack some of the damage for yourself, and that you have a good support system to help you with kind of the emotional fallout from all of that. It's just really painful, and from a prodependent place, if we were to kind of close there, I think the prodependents would always say, we hurt because we love, we hurt because we care. And the way we can't love, we can't love too much. That's not a thing. We just need to figure out how to love and who to love and when to love and the most healthy way to show that love. And so that doesn't make it all go away or make it better, but hopefully it helps partners see that they're not broken. That's, you know, there's nothing wrong with them that they are in a relationship with somebody who has acted out in these ways they could never imagine, or that they promised they never would, and they probably fully thought that they would keep that promise. But the addicted brain is the great saboteur, until they learn how to heal that and pull back on those behaviors. You know, they'll just cause themselves pain over and over and over, and then inadvertently cause all the people they love pain. So be sure that you have good support, that you have a good therapist to help you navigate the disappointment and the hurt and the baggage there. Because I think that would be very important moving forward. And good for her having all the, you know, the good start on her recovery. But even that doesn't mean that it might not be enough. You know, the questions might be too much. The pain might be too heavy. Everybody decides their level of load that they can carry. I've said this many times, but they call it the plimsoll line on a boat. The plimsoll line is the line the indicator of the amount of load that boat or that vessel can take before it takes on water. Every vessel is different. The plimsoll line is different depending on how it's crafted and created. People are the same. We all have a plimsoll line, and I couldn't tell you what anybody else's is. Some could take on a tremendous amount of load. Some gets one vessel will get one extra thing and it starts sinking. So I think we have to be super aware of what that line is inside of us. Like, when do I start taking on water where I can't function in a way that I need to or would like to in life. So I think that takes a little time to piece out and some time to heal from the trauma in order to figure that out. But hopefully you'll find someone who can do that and help you with that as well. I'm a therapist. Sorry.
I just want to point out how well-rounded Kim is. She lives in the desert, but she still knows about boats.
I mean, come on. You said I was smart, so I'm just.
Yes. Yeah, you know, and I just kind of wanted to add to what I said earlier. Sexual orientation is very, very fluid. It's influenced by a million different factors, including things like early life abuse and early sexual experiences, and, you know, whatever pornography we're exposed to in the beginning. So, and it also, and research proves this, sexual orientation is far more fluid for women than men. Women are much more able to bounce back and forth than men are. And then the other thing I wanted to say, let's talk about affairs for a second. You know, there's an affair here that lasted 9 years. But, you know, I always think, you know, the reason most affairs, I mean, I hear, you know, I work with addicts all the time, and they say, I don't know what the attraction was. My wife is so much prettier, so much smarter, so much funnier, so much more interesting. We have so much more history together. And then I get to point out, yeah, but with your affair partner, you don't have to mow the grass, and you don't have to do the dishes. And she doesn't yell at you when you leave your socks on the floor instead of putting them in the hamper. And you don't have to pay bills together, and you don't, you know, all you get is like the good part with an affair. You don't get the relationship part. And you don't even really get the good part, which is that true connection. You just get this illusion, this fantasy of a perfect relationship. And, you know, it's something over 90% of people who get divorced from partner number one and jump into the long-term affair partner end up getting divorced. They don't even last a year because suddenly they're faced with real life with that person. And real life with that person is not the same as the fantasy.
Well, I was just going to add to that, Scott. An affair is a fantasy. It's not a computer screen or an avatar or a prostitute necessarily. It could be, but most often affairs, they're just a different form of a fantasy. Like Scott said, I don't have to do the heavy lifting in a fantasy. I don't have to live real life. So if I'm turning to that fantasy, to me, it definitely holds a different, sometimes consequence if it's a live person than if it's, sometimes those consequences are different, but the concept's the same. It's still a fantasy. Of course you feel crazy about that fantasy. You don't have to do any of the heavy lifting with it. So, and affairs, and not all affairs, I mean, there's different people that are driven in different ways by affairs, but if I'm an addict, I'm driven by affairs for fantasy reasons, escape reasons, intensity reasons, not necessarily intimacy. But again, that's not for a partner to kind of pick out. That's for the person who's been engaging in those behaviors to figure out for themselves.
Yeah, but you know, it goes back to, you know, sex addiction is not about sex. You know, porn addiction is not about sex. You know, an affair is not about sex or love usually. I mean, some, you know, again,
Yeah.
you know, everybody's different, but an addiction, you know, an affair that an addict is having, or a bunch of affairs that an addict is having, it's all about fantasy. It's not about anything that's real.
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate all of your questions today and to be here today and have the discussion. Those of you who are bravely facing betrayal and love somebody, whether you're a partner, whether you're a family, whether you're, you know, it takes a lot of courage to do this. And I think more than anything, I want you to hear that, you know, loving's not a pathology. We don't have a diagnosis for loving too much. It just doesn't exist. So just figure out who's worthy of your love and when and how much, and make sure it's something that you can manage and still hold on to who you are.
Awesome. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Kim will be back in 2 weeks, I think. Matt will be back next week. So we'll see you there and then, and have a good weekend, everyone.
Bye, everyone.